Imagine a nation that for decades has been the world's paradox, a beacon of innovation and resilience, yet a crucible of tension and contradiction. Israel, a country forged in the fires of existential threat, has always lived on the edge of war, of peace, of prosperity, of crisis. But today, the edge is sharper than ever. The headlines speak of war, of rockets and reprisals, of hostages and heartbreak. But beneath the surface, a deeper, more insidious conflict is brewing, one that no Iron Dome can intercept, no airstrike can resolve. This is the story of a society at war with itself, a nation whose internal contradictions are reaching a breaking point. And if you think this is just another chapter in Israel's long history of turmoil, think again. The numbers, the protests, the fractures, they all point to something unprecedented, the real possibility of civil war, not in the streets with tanks and barricades, but in the very fabric of Israeli society. Let's start with the facts that can't be ignored. In the summer of 2025, 500,000 people flooded the streets of Tel Aviv in a single day. 1 million more marched across the country. These aren't fringe activists or political diehards. They are doctors, engineers, students, mothers, reservists, ordinary citizens who have decided that the status quo is no longer tolerable. When serving military pilots, the pride of Israel's defense, publicly denounced their government strategy, when teenagers refuse conscription en masse, when the fiscal deficit balloons to 7% of GDP and national debt surges by 9% in just 2 years, these are not the tremors of routine dissent. These are the seismic shocks of a social contract in collapse. But why now? Why, after decades of surviving wars, absorbing waves of immigration, and building a high-tech powerhouse, is Israel facing this moment of reckoning? The answer is as complex as the country itself, but it begins with a simple truth. Success can sow the seeds of its own undoing. Israel's economic miracle, its transformation from a struggling agrarian state to a global leader in technology and innovation, has created a society of extraordinary wealth and opportunity. Yet, that very success has deepened the divides between those who benefit and those who are left behind. Consider the numbers. Israel boasts more NASDAQ-listed companies than any country except the United States and China. Its per capita GDP outpaces Britain, Germany, and Canada. In March 2025, Google acquired an Israeli cybersecurity firm for $32 billion. Nvidia is pouring billions into a new tech campus. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has soared by 80% since the war began. On paper, this is an economy in rude health. But look closer, and the picture darkens. Consumer spending has plummeted by 27%. Imports are down 42%. Exports have fallen 18%. In the second quarter of 2025, the economy contracted by 3.5%, a staggering reversal for a country that once seemed immune to regional instability. The immediate culprit is, of course, the war. Since October 2023, direct costs have exceeded $40 billion, 7% of GDP, in just 18 months. The brief but intense operation against Iran alone cost $1.5 billion in 3 days. The Bank of Israel projects war-related costs through 2025 at over $55 billion. But these are just the direct costs. The real damage is in the ripple effects: lost productivity, shattered consumer confidence, a battered currency, and a government forced to make impossible choices. Yet to focus only on the war is to miss the deeper story. Israel's crisis is not just about bombs and budgets. It is about the unraveling of a delicate balance, a balance between secular and religious, Jewish and Arab, rich and poor, center and periphery. For years, Israel has managed to paper over these divisions with economic growth and national security. But now, the cracks are widening and the old bargains are breaking down. Nowhere is this more evident than in the country's dual economy. On one side, the high-tech sector, 9% of the workforce, world-leading venture capital and productivity that rivals Silicon Valley. On the other, the rest of the country, especially the ultra-Orthodox Haredi and Arab communities, where unemployment, poverty, and exclusion are the norm. The numbers are stark. Half of ultra-Orthodox men do not work, relying on state stipends and community charity. Among Arab women, labor force participation is far below the national average. These are not just cultural choices, they are economic time bombs. The Israel Democracy Institute estimates that low ultra-Orthodox workforce participation will cost the country 10% of its GDP by 2050, over 160 billion shekels in today's terms. The Bank of Israel's chief economist says that closing this employment gap could boost annual growth by 0.6%, a 22% increase over current projections. But the problem is not just about jobs. It's about who pays, who serves, and who sacrifices. Haredi households pay 1/3 the taxes of non-Haredi households, despite being 1.5 times larger. 70% of Haredim and 57% of Arab Israelis live below the poverty line. Even after government transfers, the majority remain in poverty. This is not a critique of any community. It is a warning about sustainability. When one segment of the population bears the overwhelming burden of military service and tax revenue, while another is largely exempt, you create the conditions for resentment, division, and ultimately fracture. And when the exempt population is the fastest growing demographic in the country, the math becomes inescapable. By 2060, the ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations will make up half of Israel's total population. If current trends continue, a shrinking tax base will be asked to support an ever-growing dependent population, while also funding the military needs of a state surrounded by hostile neighbors. The Bank of Israel and the Finance Ministry have both sounded the alarm. Without integration of the ultra-Orthodox and Arab citizens into the workforce, the country faces not just slower growth, but the risk of fiscal crisis, potentially even bankruptcy. This is not a distant threat. It is a present danger, accelerating with every year of inaction. But the economic and demographic rifts are only part of the story. To truly understand why Israel stands at the precipice, you must look at the daily realities that shape the lives of its citizens. The cost of living, the price of a home, the struggle to make ends meet. For many Israelis, the dream of owning a home has become a cruel joke. The average price of a house in Israel has soared to 2.23 million shekels, about $660,000. In Tel Aviv, that number jumps to 14 million shekels, or $1.2 million. These prices have nearly doubled in a decade, far outpacing wage growth for all but the elite. For young families, the barriers are almost insurmountable. A down payment of 840,000 shekels, mortgage rates above 5%, and a rental market where even a modest 3-room apartment in Tel Aviv costs 7,000 shekels a month, $2,000, and that's at the low end. This is not just a housing crisis, it is a crisis of hope. The social protests that erupted in 2011 over the price of cottage cheese and rent were dismissed by some as trivial, but they were the canary in the coal mine, a warning that the system was failing ordinary people. Today, those frustrations have multiplied. The OECD ranks Israel as one of the most expensive countries in the developed world, with restrictive planning regulations and limited competition driving up prices for everything from groceries to gasoline. When the price of pasta sparks protests, when a boycott over chocolate pudding goes viral, it's not about food. It's about dignity, about the sense that the game is rigged, that the promise of a better life is slipping away. And so the anger spills into the streets. In August 2025, 500,000 people marched in Tel Aviv. 1 million more joined protests nationwide. These are not isolated incidents. In March, more than 100,000 demonstrated across multiple cities. Throughout the summer, tens of thousands blocked highways, surrounded government buildings, and clashed with police. The scale is unprecedented, but so is the composition. University presidents, high-tech executives, reservists, and even elite military pilots have joined the protests. In April 2025, over 1,000 current and former pilots signed an open letter denouncing the government's war strategy as politically motivated. These are not the usual suspects. These are the pillars of Israeli society, the very people who have kept the country strong. The government's response has been swift and severe. Since January 2023, over 1,600 Israelis have been arrested for protesting, more than 700 since the war began. In 2025, a Shin Bet affidavit revealed that the Prime Minister had ordered surveillance of citizens involved in demonstrations. The Violence Monitoring Organization reported over 1,500 incidents of violence in 2024, most attributed to police actions, water cannons, stun grenades, mass arrests. These are not the tools of a government confident in its legitimacy. They are the desperate measures of a leadership losing its grip. But the most dangerous feedback loops are not on the streets. They are in the economy, in the institutions, in the hearts and minds of the people. Fiscal stress leads to austerity or tax hikes, which drive up the cost of living, which fuels more protests, which creates political instability, which scares off investment, which slows growth, which worsens the fiscal position, which leads to more austerity. It is a vicious cycle, one that has broken other countries before. Demographic trends shrink the tax base and increase dependency, putting more pressure on public finances, forcing either benefit cuts or higher taxes on the working population, which breeds resentment and hardens divisions. Military service, once a unifying rite of passage, is now a source of bitterness, as the burden falls on a shrinking minority, while exemptions for others become politically untouchable. This is not a problem that will resolve itself. It is a problem that compounds year after year until something breaks. And yet, some will argue that Israel has always faced existential threats, that it has always found a way to survive. Why should this time be any different? The answer lies in three fundamental changes. First, the fiscal arithmetic has changed. Previous wars were short, sharp shocks. The current conflict is a grinding, open-ended drain on resources with no clear end in sight. The costs are not a one-off. They are cumulative and they are accelerating. Second, the demographic trends are unprecedented. In the past, the ultra-Orthodox community was small enough that their non-participation in the workforce and military could be absorbed. By 2060, they will be a quarter of the population. The math simply doesn't work at that scale. Third, and most crucially, the social contract is unraveling in a way it never has before. Previous protest movements 2011, the 2023 judicial reform protests eventually faded. Today's protests are bigger, more sustained, and more radical. When university presidents march, when elite military units refuse orders, when teenagers reject conscription, you are not looking at a policy dispute. You are looking at a legitimacy crisis. The data is unambiguous. In 2025, polls showed a majority of Israelis opposed ending the January ceasefire. Most wanted negotiations to continue, yet the government pressed on with the war. The disconnect between public will and government action could not be starker. When citizens believe their leaders are sacrificing hostages for political survival, when they see their economic future mortgaged to maintain a fragile coalition, the result is not just anger, it is alienation. And alienation in a democracy is the seed of revolution. But let's be clear, civil war in a modern democracy does not look like the images from Sarajevo in the 1990s. It is not tanks in the streets or militias fighting for territory. It is a society that can no longer agree on basic facts, on shared values, on who should bear the burdens and reap the benefits. It is half the population believing the government is illegitimate, while the other half sees the protesters as traitors. It is communities that no longer speak the same language, that live in separate media bubbles, that increasingly segregate in neighborhoods and schools. It is a state where the formal institutions still function, but the informal bonds of solidarity, shared sacrifice, mutual trust, common purpose are eroding day by day. The economic signals are already flashing red. Currency markets are volatile, not because of bad monetary policy, but because of lost confidence. The stock market rises even as the streets fill with protesters, not a sign of strength, but of a bifurcated society. International institutions are sounding the alarm. Fitch downgraded Israel's credit rating in August 2024, not because of debt levels, but because of political instability. The IMF and OECD have issued repeated warnings about the need for fiscal discipline and structural reform. Their language is diplomatic, but the message is clear. Israel's future depends on political choices that are becoming harder and harder to make. And here lies the central dilemma. The reforms needed to fix these problems, integrating the ultra-Orthodox into the workforce and military, improving Arab educational and economic outcomes, reducing the cost of living through deregulation, containing deficits through spending discipline, are all politically explosive. They require breaking long-standing deals between religious and secular, left and right, center and periphery. They require courage, consensus, and sacrifice, qualities in short supply in a country at war with itself. So what happens if nothing changes? Imagine the war drags on for another year, the direct costs climb to 80 billion shekels, the deficit stays stubbornly above 5%, economic growth stalls or turns negative. The shekel weakens, inflation creeps higher, and interest rates refuse to budge. Protests swell in size and frequency. More soldiers refuse to serve. More families quietly pack their bags and leave, taking their skills and dreams elsewhere. The high-tech sector, once Israel's pride, begins to hollow out as its brightest minds seek stability abroad. Foreign investment slows, spooked by headlines of unrest and uncertainty. The government, desperate to hold its coalition together, cannot touch the ultra-Orthodox exemptions. It cannot cut spending because so much of it is locked into defense, debt service, and mandatory transfers. So it raises taxes on those who are already shouldering the heaviest load. VAT goes up, income taxes rise. Property taxes follow. The cost of living crisis deepens, and with it, the sense of injustice. The secular middle class, the engine of Israel's economy and military, begins to ask a dangerous question: why should we keep sacrificing when others refuse? The ultra-Orthodox community, feeling besieged, retreats further into insularity. Arab citizens, already marginalized, see their opportunities shrink even more. The bonds that once held the country together, shared sacrifice, mutual trust, a sense of common destiny, begin to fray, not with a dramatic rupture, but with 1,000 small acts of withdrawal. A family emigrates, a reservist refuses to serve, a business moves its headquarters overseas, a neighborhood becomes more homogeneous, a conversation between neighbors grows tense and then falls silent. This is how democracies fracture, not with a single explosion, but with a slow, relentless erosion of the ties that bind. The warning signs are everywhere if you know where to look. When the people who pay the taxes and fight the wars no longer believe the system is fair, when the fastest growing communities are locked out of the workforce and the national conversation, when the government's legitimacy is questioned by its own elites, the risk is not just political instability, it is the slow-motion unraveling of the nation itself. Yet history is not destiny. Israel has reinvented itself before. It has overcome impossible odds, built a thriving society from the ashes of exile and war. But reinvention requires honesty, a willingness to confront hard truths, to break old taboos, to imagine a future that is not just a continuation of the present. It requires leaders who can build bridges, not just between parties, but between communities, between generations, between the winners and losers of the new economy. It requires citizens who refuse to give up on the idea of a common good, who are willing to fight not just for their own interests, but for the soul of their country. The nightmare is not inevitable, but neither is it a fantasy. The choice, as always, belongs to the people. The question is whether they will seize it before the window closes, before the divisions become too deep, the resentments too bitter, the exodus too great. Israel's greatest test is not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of its people. The world is watching. The future is unwritten.